There were plenty of Plantagenets floating around the court of King Henry VIII, and chief among them were the Pole family. Its matriarch, Margaret, may be the most famous Pole, but close on her heels is Reginald Pole, her third son, and the man who, some would argue, was largely responsible for the destruction of his family. Reginald started out as a man who Henry VIII sponsored and celebrated, but soon turned on the king, becoming an outright and vocal critic of Henry's all-too-bloody reign. To discuss Reginald with me, I'm pleased to welcome historian Dr. Helen Hyde onto the podcast for a discussion based around her recent book, The King's Traitor, Reginald Pole and the Tudors. We explore Reginald's early life, his position as an arch-enemy of Henry VIII and what drove him to that, his very close bond to Queen Mary I, and even his friendship with none other than Michelangelo himself. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast, episode 116, The King's Traitor, Reginald Pole and the Tudors, with Dr. Helen Hyde. Welcome to the Tudor Chest podcast. Helen Hyde, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Adam. How are you?
Very well, thanks. Thank you for coming on the podcast for the first time. You're here to talk about a man that I'm quite au fait with, Reginald Pole, but is certainly a figure that is not regularly discussed despite his big impact. I'm here to talk about your book, The King's Traitor, Reginald Pole and the Tudors, that came out earlier this month. Before we get into that discussion, a few questions to get to know you a bit better, if that's okay. So could you provide me with a short introduction into your background, so where you grew up and what it is that you now do full-time?
I grew up all over the place because from the age of 13, we moved around a lot with my dad's job. I've lived in Italy as well. I'm a professional cat sitter and I'm also an independent historian, and the balance is 60-40. And as a cat sitter, if you love cats, it's a perfect job, because I get very busy periods of the year and then quiet periods when I can research and write. Based
on where you grew up, Battle, maybe that sparked the passion for history. Was there something in your childhood that sparked your passion for particularly Tudor history?
Regarding Tudor history, Keith Michell, The Six Wives of Henry VIII, absolutely loved it. And a passion I share with you is Anne of a Thousand Days, Geneviève Bujold, who in my opinion is perfection as Anne. She's absolutely marvellous. What sparked a real obsession was the second year of my degree at Lancaster, when I did a course on Italian Renaissance art, and that was it. I was lost.
Keith Michell doesn't get enough praise or attention today. For obvious reasons, Jonathan Rhys-Meyers commands a lot of attention for people who are slightly newer to the Tudors, and I suppose even more recently Damian Lewis. But if you look back on the Keith Michell performances, for me, he is the quintessential Henry VIII. I thought he was utterly remarkable.
And I would agree with that, yes. And I loved Glenda Jackson in the series on Elizabeth as well.
Yeah, again, magnificent. So if you had the chance to jump in a time travel machine and witness a single moment from history, what would you choose?
Right, this is going to be a bit of a rare one. Given my passion for art, we're in Florence. It's about 1485, but the date isn't certain. We're in Botticelli's workshop, and he's just finished painting the work, The Birth of Venus. He rips off the sheet that covers it and goes, "What do you think, chaps?" And it's one of my all-time favourite paintings. I love it. To see it for the first time, brand new, must have been amazing.
Nice. That is very specific, but
it is. I did my MPhil on Botticelli, so I'm a bit of a Botticelli nut.
So as I said a moment ago, we're here to talk about Reginald Pole, and because you've just released a book on him, The King's Traitor. So firstly, why Reginald? What was it about him that made you want to write this book?
Okay, more generally, you probably need to know my husband says I've been suffering from a fascination with Renaissance cardinals and men of the church for over 20 years. I published a monograph on one cardinal from one chapter of my PhD and researched several others, and Pole keeps cropping up. He never quite goes away, he lurks in the background. He was well known to the Sowley family, and during lockdown, it came to me, but there's no accessible biography of Pole, and certainly one that doesn't cover his career in the church, which is what you have to really include in it. The last one was Schenck in about 1950, I think, and I don't even think that's even in print anymore. I find him really fascinating. I could even, having written the book, write other books on just some of the chapters. There is that much to him. He's multifaceted on all levels, really. Why? I think because he was such an almost man, almost killed by Henry, almost Pope, almost Mary's husband. And of course, he was our last Catholic Archbishop of Canterbury. So he is important. And I just think he needs to be better known. And I too was very cross that the Pole family was sidelined in the final Wolf Hall.
It's such a bizarre. I think there must have been a lot more filmed that just didn't make the cut. Because particularly in the case of Harriet Walter, to cast a dame in the role of Margaret Pole and then have her in one scene in the very first episode doesn't... Well, I know that there was a lot more film because I saw a clip of her and Damian Lewis at Buckingham Palace with the King.
Ooh.
And the King said, said to Damian Lewis, I loved Wolf Hall, it was wonderful. And Damian Lewis said, well, Harriet was in it as well. And she went, yes, but 90% of it's on the cutting room floor. So,
oh dear.
I think the big issue I took with it was the fact that actually, unless you, like you or I know, we know what the Exeter conspiracy was, what the show doesn't explain is suddenly why Geoffrey Pole is in prison and has attempted suicide. You kind of have to figure that out for yourself.
You do.
And unless you are able to do that, it could be quite confusing. So yeah, I found that all very bizarre.
But no, I was really cross about it, because essentially, if younger people than me watch Wolf Hall and base their history on that, the Poles and Reginald were B players. They weren't.
Yeah, that's how I describe them today. People think of them as the Tudor B list, but they were fundamental to the court of Henry VIII. And when we pin it down, had a much better claim to the throne than the Tudors.
Exactly.
And on that point, for the avoidance of doubt, can you explain who was Reginald Pole from an ancestry perspective?
Okay, you're better at this than me because your chapter on his on his ancestry was really, really good. He was born in 1500, the third son of Margaret of Clarence and Richard Pole. Her name, Margaret of Clarence, says it all. She was the daughter of George, Duke of Clarence, and all this means is that he was very closely related to Henry VIII. His ancestry was a plus and a burden. It came to play even in the year he was born. Margaret's brother was put to death because of who he was, and it never left him, and his blood was the downfall of his family, really.
Yeah, I describe them and the other White Rose families, the Courtenays, the Lyles. They are a ready-made affront, aren't they, to the Tudors? I mean, that's what these people were.
Yes.
So at quite a young age, Reginald is given over to the church. Now, what led to this and how did it change his childhood compared to his siblings?
Okay, well, that's quite interesting. I think when Richard died, Margaret was poor. There's no doubt about that. There's records, which I think you cite, of Margaret Beaufort giving her handouts. So dedicating him to the church would have saved on his education, whatever he felt at the time. And I suspect at the time he wasn't at all that way inclined. And once he came to the king's attention, a dazzling and hopefully lucrative church career awaited him. Steve Gunn, who kindly read the first draft of my book, did say that it was always useful for families to have a big churchman on the side, basically to sort out business with Rome, which otherwise could take centuries. And it adds a gloss to their name as well. It's just very useful. How did it affect him? His education was different. He wasn't brought up in another noble's household. He didn't learn to joust. He learnt Latin and Greek. He was highly educated. I think the fact that he was educated to be a priest, he was sent to Magdalen at Oxford, age 12. The fact that he was educated to be a priest and not a courtier affected what we would call his social skills. I don't think he totally knew the ropes. I don't think he realised how to behave in certain situations or what the consequences could be. And the fact that he was brought up by religious people, I think also one of the adjectives I would apply to him is terminally naive. And he was naive.
At what point does Henry VIII start paying attention to Reginald, and how do we see that take shape?
Possibly before 1513, but I've no evidence of that. Certainly in 1513, when he would have been 13 years old, and ergo of some interest, he was given an ecclesiastical pension and the promise of a benefice. And Henry had only certain ways of rewarding people, which was basically money and position, because that was the way he was a patron. And from 15, 17, 18 and 19, a lot more positions and a lot more money followed. Yeah, that essentially is it. So up until the age of, but with no proof of this, 12, 13, he was under Henry's radar. But if he was out of the court, he will have been.
Okay. And where was he, where do we know for certain that he was educated? And in particular, I suppose I'm talking now about Italy. And what were the crowds that he was mixing in when he goes out to Padua in particular?
Well, Henry sent him out, I think, with the hope that he would come back and be really, really useful to him. And to get that, he needed to have a humanist education. He needed to be well grounded in Latin and Greek. There's a suggestion at some point he was learning Hebrew for Hebrew texts. He needed to be able to read and talk about ancient texts, religion, philosophy, and law. And certainly in the early 16th century, just as we love Italian food now, they loved Italian education. Lots of English nobles went there to study, make connections with other scholars, governments, and basically to better themselves. Only a few were the king's scholar, which is what Reginald was, and they were almost mini ambassadors for Henry and his government. Reginald mixed very freely with the Venetian government. He was also in highbrow company at Padua. I think someone described it as essentially a completion of Oxford, really, continuation of it and completion of it. He met people like Gian Matteo Ghiberti, who was well known nationally as a good man, and who had connections to Leo X. Interestingly, he's from Genoa as well, and also knew the Sauli. So this all joins up. And he met Pietro Bembo, who was internationally renowned. It also gave him the opportunity to become a patron in his own right. He had his own household with servants and academics, which I think previously he hadn't. He'd been either living with the Carthusians or at Magdalen or with his mother. So, yeah, it was, I don't think, though, that they were there knocking back extra glasses of wine every night and having a damn good time. I think they were looking at texts most of the time.
Based on what you've said then, he's being raised, well, we know he's been raised by the church. He's very studious. He is anything but effectively a courtier, which is absolutely the roles that his siblings go into. What do we know of his relationship with his siblings? I imagine that, I mean, obviously things change quite a lot later, which we'll come to, but what do we know of his relationship with his siblings around the 1520s, for example?
Very little indeed. I'd be interested to know in your opinion on his feelings for Geoffrey. Get a general feeling of exasperation with Geoffrey, and I've no evidence for that whatsoever. But he doesn't crop up much at all. No evidence of his relations with Arthur or with Ursula until later in life. And Ursula we only know of indirectly through his letters to his niece. However, I think we can safely say that he was proud and close to Henry Lord Montague, his eldest brother. He does say at one point, for many years further on, the death which most upset him after that of Margaret was that of Lord Montague.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly what I saw. And I think it's just that we're stuck as well because Geoffrey Pole was the fifth child. He's the youngest of the bunch, the fourth son. We don't have much information about Geoffrey until the Exeter conspiracy. And what we do know is that he was a bit of a liability and was constantly burdened by debt and all the rest of it. So it's quite difficult to pin it down. But I would agree that I think from what we can see, his relationship with Geoffrey only developed when it got quite sour. And then things improved a bit. But yeah, it's very, very difficult to say. Reginald, I suppose, truly resurfaces from an English perspective, I suppose, when it comes to the king's great matter. So how did Henry VIII lean on Reginald to help secure the annulment?
Okay, Reginald came back to England in 1526. and it was starting to be a very different country. I suspect Henry called him back, but I've no evidence for this. He went to Sheen to study, wanted to lead a quiet life, and then he made the dreaded mistake of wanting to study in Paris. Got Henry's permission to go there, and with a decent pension to boot. He was certainly there by late 1529, which means also that he'd been in England for 2 years watching the royal marriage very noisily unravel. And in May 1530, Henry charged him to get opinions from the Paris theologians that his marriage to Catherine of Aragon was invalid. Reginald succeeded and did very well, and he was very much in Henry's good books. He had money showered at him. The Duke of Norfolk, God bless him, praised him. Yes, I know. And then as Reginald's views changed over the years, his rewriting of this episode changed as well. But there can be no doubt that he did acquiesce in all this at that time.
Yes, and he gives every indication that he is in support of, well, not every indication, but he's certainly not effusively against the annulment and the marriage to Anne Boleyn. He's not vocal about it necessarily either, but he really, really drags his feet, and he eventually responds with a treatise which comes 2 months after Anne Boleyn is executed, so that tells you just how much he is dragging his feet. It's effectively a small book, though, simply called... It's got a much longer title, but the simple name is De Unitate. So what was this, and how did it differ, I suppose, from what Henry VIII was looking to hear?
Yeah, it's really not an easy read. It was one of those, oh God, I need to finish this. As you say, he'd been under a lot of pressure to write, and he kept saying he'd do so, got to the point where he had to. The book isn't just about Henry or his divorce. It's a result of witnessing the separation of England from Rome and the destruction of Fisher and More, and also several Carthusian monks who suffered a really nasty end. The problem between him leaving England and writing this is that he had literally got religion. And that's not putting too fine a point on it. Some possible indirect evidence of this from his time in England when he retired to Sheen, but as early as 1532, he was no longer interested in ancient texts, but said himself, divine things are so much better than human. He's not necessarily the type of chap you'd want at a dinner party, but he was what he was. He genuinely believed in the Catholic Church, the Pope, a rich internal spiritual life, and he started it in September 1535 and finished it by March 1536. And yes, it took 2 months for him to send Michael Throckmorton off with it. He wanted Henry to return to the church, but he was also, again, and I keep coming up with this word, naive, if he genuinely believed that Henry would stand for, let alone respond to, positively, being told that he kept Fisher in horrendous conditions, that he was a murderer, that he was a wild beast, that he was incestuous, he was influenced by Satan, not suitable for a holy burial, and that his daughter Elizabeth was the daughter of a prostitute, i.e. Anne.
He goes for it.
So you read it and you think, oh, Reggie, what are you doing? But he did, and he sent it. And we're back to his naivety again, I think. What was he expecting?
Yeah, I think, and we'll come to this in more detail shortly, but I think that physical separation from his family, from the realities of life in England, will have undoubtedly played a part. We'll come back to that. It goes without saying, though, that obviously Henry VIII does not respond well to this. How does it impact Reginald's family back in England?
They were literally hauled over the coals. Montague was called in, shouted at, told what was what. The King spoke to Margaret Pole. They wrote, I consider them to be heartfelt letters. I don't think they were necessarily dictated by the council. I think they were genuinely shocked that he could do this, because their view of him would probably have been of a nice, sincere, shy man. Montague, I think, told him, farewell all bonds of nature. And his mother said that not even the death of her husband or a child had hurt her so much. The coup de grace on all of this was that we're still in 1536. He accepted the cardinalate from the Pope. And then in 1537, he really does go a little bit beyond the pale. And at this point, he is the arch traitor, and the plots to kill him start.
It's a funny one, isn't it? I think that in their heart, I'm certain that in their heart of hearts, by this point, Margaret and Henry probably agree with everything that Reginald is saying. But because they were in England and knew the way the court ran, and in particular the way Henry VIII would respond, that they were never ever going to vocalise that. But I do think they probably sympathised with a lot of what Reginald was saying.
I think I would agree with that. They wrote the letters because they were so upset. They had to protect their backs, but they were also very, very upset.
Yeah, and I think there was probably a bit of lip service in there as well. You know, they were saying what they knew Henry wanted to hear. I think there will have been an element of that there. But it was all about survival, and that was, Reginald was safely ensconced, but they weren't. And shortly after the De Unitate makes its way to England, not that long afterwards, we have the Pilgrimage of Grace breaking out. So how does Reginald respond to news of the Pilgrimage of Grace?
In my opinion, he was probably sat in Rome with Paul III, rubbing his hands with glee. He pleaded for help from Charles V for England before writing De Unitate. There's evidence of him wanting a peaceful approach to getting Henry back into the church. And in De Unitate, he pleads for it, and I think from Francis I even more. What is puzzling about the papal and Reginald's response to the Pilgrimage of Grace is the time involved. Pilgrimage started in October, even allowing for slow postal services. He's not appointed legate until February, when the pilgrimage was literally in its dying embers. It has to be said that it was Reginald who pushed to be appointed legate, and he pushed for the terms of the legation, so he very much knew what he was doing. It was ostensibly a peace legation, but the Pope and Reginald wanted Francis and Charles to come together to support the revolt and act against Henry. He was spectacularly unsuccessful. Francis wouldn't see him, had him expelled, and neither would Charles V. And he returned to Rome in October 1537, exhausted. I think, you see, in his eyes, from Henry's eyes and from our viewpoint possibly, he was a traitor, but he was doing what he thought was best for England. England had left the Church of God. I don't know how you feel about that.
I firmly believe he thought he was doing the right thing. But again, it does come back to this slight naivete about understanding what was going on back home. But from what I understand, there was talk that he would also sail for England and be part of if he was able to get Francis, Charles, etc. on board, then Reginald would set sail for England as well and join in and not physically join the fight, but be involved, be part of it.
Yes, that was on the cards at the time.
Assassins were sent to try and kill Reginald. We know that, and we know that one of them was Sir Francis Bryan, the rogue of Henry VIII's court, famously with one eye. But Reginald perpetually manages to evade capture. So how and where is he going at this point? Who is protecting him, and so on?
Okay, there were lots of plots, an awful number of plots up until Henry's death. Henry did not let go. And the one thing about the final Wolf Hall was that Henry accuses Cromwell of not giving him Pole, and it rankled right until the end. For the most part, Reginald, despite being shy and naive, he didn't hide. 1537, he was protected by the Bishop of Liège, and he didn't go there in disguise. And there is a list of at least 6 possible assassins over the coming years. And that's 6 that we know of, that we have documented proof of. And that included ambassadors. On a second legation in 1540, he travelled incognito, and again in 1545. But for the most part, he was out in the open, literally waving his hands, jazz hands, I'm here. And the Pope did give him a bodyguard. I think, again, God comes into this. He trusted in God's providence. He says, he for whose cause I'm persecuted is greater and more powerful than he who persecutes me. In the end, Henry, exasperated at the incompetence of all these amateurs, coughs up a huge amount of money for an Italian mercenary, Ludovico Dall'Armi, and that didn't do any good either, partly because of Dall'Armi's personality, which was chaotic, to put it mildly. How did Pole survive? Sympathetic rulers, other cardinals. There were lots of manoeuvres by other cardinals to let him know what was going on, to divert him. Papal troops, and frankly, he was bloody minded. Henry wasn't going to get him.
And he's actually warned of the assassins by Geoffrey Pole.
Some, not very many. And that's at the beginning. The others, no, Geoffrey doesn't tell him about those.
Do you think, and this I suppose comes to the heart of Reginald's story in this window, do you think Reginald being separated from his family fundamentally changed his sense of loyalty to them? So, had he remained in England, do you think he would have been less argumentative with Henry? Or do you think that ultimately, because of the upbringing he had in the church, that was always going to be his guiding light? I suppose it's a difficult one to say, but I'm just, curious to know your thoughts there.
If I'm honest now, it is literally the religious conversion, the coming to God, as you say, which took precedence over everything else. That said, if he'd been in England, would he have been so religious? Impossible to say. But he was a man of great conscience, and he did put his conscience first, and essentially the consequences be damned. And he was very close to the Pope, so that will have swayed him. It's a really difficult one to call this, Adam. Probably he would have been less argumentative.
Yeah, I would agree. Because I think, had he seen... I think what it comes down to is the fact that he's removed physically from seeing the colossal changes, not just in Henry's court, but in Henry's character.
Exactly.
That is where his mother and his brothers, his sister to a lesser degree, because she was up in Staffordshire, but certainly his eldest brother and his mother have a front row seat to the ebb and flow of Henry VIII's court and their positions therein. And I suppose Reginald, yes, he owes a lot of his early education to Henry VIII, but he gets to a point where his favour, his position, isn't dictated by Henry, whereas his mother, his eldest brother, his youngest brother, all of their positions at court, that's all controlled by and maintained with the favour of the king. So fundamentally, their positions are so miles apart that he, I think, would have just, there would have been a fundamental break in how he saw the world versus his family.
I would agree with that. And I think Rome also offered him the chance to reform the church, and he was very keen on that. But yes, I agree, there is a huge disconnect between Italy and England.
Well, this is another one that's probably quite hard to answer, but we do have the Exeter conspiracy, which blows up. With the Exeter conspiracy, we see the arrest and eventual execution of Reginald's eldest brother Henry, Baron Montague. We see the executions of Henry Courtenay, the Marquis of Exeter, which is what the Exeter conspiracy is named after. And eventually, Margaret Pole, his mother, is executed in May 1541. How much responsibility do you think Reginald should take for the destruction of his family?
I don't think we can give him all the responsibility for their deaths. And again, this is a very tricky one. And we're again back to his naivety and this disconnect, possibly because of his education, again, because he wasn't in England, because he wasn't brought up at court. I don't think he realised quite how warped, if I can use that word, Henry had become, for whatever reason that is. Anne Boleyn, the pilgrimage, his fall from a horse. And the extermination of his family must have seemed pretty remote as a possibility. And it has to be said as well, Henry didn't have to kill them. He didn't. He could have stripped them of their honours, their lands, their wealth, made them terminally poor. And that would have worked equally well as a punishment. But I do think by this point, because of De Unitate, he hated. It had gone around Europe that he was an incestuous wild beast. He hated Reginald so much that nothing other than death would do, hurting Reginald through that.
Yeah, I've always had the sense that there was a, if I can't get to him, I'll turn on his family element from Henry. And sadly, when we strip it back, Reginald is to blame there. But the Pole family, I mean, that was one of the things that I think, quite, when I was researching my book, when I was going into when I first had the idea and was first mapping it out, I had the expectation that I was going to come away from this believing that there was no real evidence for any of it. But actually, if we follow, and this is a big if, but if we follow the changes that were made to the Treasons Act of 1530, then some of the things that if Henry Pole said some of the things that he said to have said, and the same with the Marquis of Exeter and
Yes.
Geoffrey Pole, then they all crossed a line. And when I looked at the research, I was like, oh, okay, I didn't expect to come to that conclusion that actually one could argue that if you simply follow the law, Henry VIII had some, and big inverted commas there, but some justification because they crossed the line with some of what they said. So it's not Reginald is not solely to blame, but I think it's him that puts the spotlight. Had he not done what he'd done, I think the gossiping, because really, I think you and I could probably agree, what these men were doing was moaning. They were gossiping and showing their angst and anger about the way the court had changed. There was never any plan to try and oust Henry VIII. They had their chance with the Pilgrimage of Grace and they didn't take it. I think what it was really was just them moaning. And unfortunately, Reginald just shines this massive spotlight on them at the very worst time.
Yeah, I would agree with that, I think.
And again, it's a tough one, but Margaret's execution is particularly notorious for its unnecessary nature, the cruelty of it. It's a badly botched execution. I conclude that ultimately it was driven kind of by spite. Do you think, had Reginald been captured, had Henry VIII got to him, that Margaret, because also the other thing, the reason I say that is that Margaret is executed a long time after the rest. The rest of the executions take place towards the end of 1538, the start of 1539. Margaret's not executed until May 1541. So do you think, had Henry captured Reginald, that Margaret probably would have regained her freedom?
This is a difficult one as well. My honest opinion, my honest opinion is no. Or if he did, I suspect, because my opinion of Henry at this time is, to put it mildly, extremely negative. I think he may have released her temporarily so that she could watch Reginald die, chained above a fire as he burnt slowly to death, which is what Henry wanted to do to him. What happened after that? I suppose he may have taken pity and released her, but he was obsessed. But he had loved this woman at some point. He had loved Margaret Pole. There was just this
totally
seismic change in his personality caused by events or whatever. Do you think she would have been released?
I do. I have a feeling that she would have, had he got Reginald, I think he would have maybe released Margaret in time. And I say that because eventually releases Gertrude Courtenay. He releases Gertrude Courtenay before Margaret is executed, but he releases Gertrude Courtenay, and there was so much more to pin against Gertrude Courtenay than there was Margaret. So this tells us that Henry is not above releasing people. He releases Geoffrey Pole, one of the biggest surprises I think he ever makes.
That's completely beyond me.
It's baffling, isn't it? I mean, this is a man who is clearly guilty of treason, but he gets off. And I think he gets off because he was so broken and probably gave so much information. But it's a very baffling decision from a man who executes people left, right and centre.
No, I would totally agree with that. I'm interested that you think he would have released Margaret.
I think he would.
I'm open to being convinced to your viewpoint on that.
I think it's because there was even a sense at the time that this was unjust and that she was an elderly lady who really couldn't do anyone any harm. Her spirit had been broken, her eldest son executed. There was no way back. And I think her execution is driven by spite. I think it is Henry going, I cannot get to your bloody son. Yes. I'm going to execute you instead. So that's what I mean. Had he got her son, I think that itch would have been scratched and he would have then regained some measure potentially of possibly going, okay, I'll release Margaret. Because we also, as I say, he does release Gertrude Courtenay, but equally, Gertrude Courtenay marries a Plantagenet. She isn't one.
Yeah.
Margaret is, but she's also elderly. She's not going to have any more sons or anything like that. So I'm inclined to conclude that he might have eventually given her freedom, but it's a huge we'll never know, is it?
It is, I'm afraid.
So Henry VIII dies. Edward VI reigns for not very long. Reginald then returns to England eventually in 1554, a year into the reign of Queen Mary I. So talk to me about his actually very ostentatious, I think like 2,000 accompanying him into London. What happened here?
Crowds gathered from the moment he landed, literally. Did he set out for it to be ostentatious? He wasn't an ostentatious man. I think there was partly a natural response by the people to someone who'd been exiled for 22 years and who'd been the victim of a monarch. Henry wasn't very well loved by the end of his reign, as I understand it. I doubt if Reginald wanted such ostentation. He was very modest, but he was also in as a papal legate. They did finally give him permission to come as papal legate, so there did have to be some ceremony. Remembering that, of course, England was still substantially Catholic, and we're into Mary's reign by now. He was the representative of the Pope, and as such, had to be welcomed. I think he writes in a letter, which is in the Vatican on the 26th of November, to the Pope, how literally he was surrounded by people from when he landed, lots of nobles sent by the King and Queen, and the Queen even sent her boat to bring him into London, where the King greeted him. Again, this was a singular favour. Both were pleased to see him. Mary hadn't seen him in many years, and he had suffered more, in fact, than, well, as much, if not more, than she had suffered. And he was a person of consequence, and there did need to be some ceremony. It was like welcoming the Pope, because he was the Pope in all but name, which is ironic because he had almost become Pope not that many years before.
And I suppose he was also a representative of the old royal family as well. And
exactly,
particularly in London, the York family were very fondly thought of. So I suppose there was also that element added in as well.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point.
He does, however, repeatedly butt heads with Philip of Spain. Why? What was going on there?
I don't think they butted heads. I think it was a complicated relationship. They saw each other as equals, essentially. Partly, Philip was a religious man. Pole was the Pope's representative. When Pole writes to Philip, he doesn't write like a servant. He writes like a very confident person who knows who he is. And he was very indebted to Philip for helping bring England back to the Catholic Church, and above all, sorting out the extremely thorny and tedious problem of church property, which, as you know, with the dissolution of the monasteries, lots of people got hold of loads of land and wouldn't let England be reconciled to Rome until they were told that they could keep the land with no consequences to their soul. He also esteemed Pole enough to entrust Mary to him when he was away, which was quite often, and to appoint him to the Select Council, who were to run England in his absence. Problems began when Philip wanted to involve England in the war against France and the papacy. And Pole literally was torn between the Pope, fairly obviously, Paul III, who was, how can I put it, not the sanest Pope, is the most polite way of putting it, and England. So he wrote to Philip and he pressed and pressed and pressed for peace. He really was very, very demanding of it. No go. When Philip returned to England, Pole avoided him. He went to Canterbury so that there could be no talk of him being overly favourable to Philip, partly because he was having these tremendous problems with Paul IV. The Pope himself called Pole an heretic. I mean, it was just completely bizarre. One thing I would say is that Pole thought sufficiently highly of Philip to entrust his servants to him after his death, and Philip did nothing. Partly money and partly, I think, could he be bothered?
So he is made Archbishop of Canterbury in 1556. Mary's reign is, of course, famous for the burnings. It's undoubtedly the most fundamental, famous part of her tenure as queen. I think it's slightly unfair or at very least contradictory when we look at the behaviour of both her sister and her father. But how much of a hand does Reginald actually play in this less than savoury part, I suppose, of Mary's reign?
Sadly, a lot. I wish he hadn't, but he did. Nothing could be done regarding the burnings without Pole's say-so, and she says as such in directions of Queen Mary to her council regarding the reform of the church. Eamon Duffy is the best historian to read on this, and his evidence is compelling. And I do know that there'll be a friend of mine listening to this who's a Pole fanatic who'll be going, no, I don't agree. Well, you may not agree, dear, but unfortunately it's true. The documents don't lie. The bottom line was canon law dictated that heretics who would not repent, and Reginald was really keen to give them every chance to repent, he really did do his utmost, were to be burnt, and they were. End of story. By the Pope, once again, the less than savoury Paul IV, who was accused of being too lenient with the heretics. And frankly, 283, or whatever figure we want to use, doesn't strike me as a big case of leniency. One of Paul's servants who was in Rome said they ought to consider what he's doing in England and how he is persecuting heretics. He also, sadly, became particularly active once he was Archbishop of Canterbury, and the last burnings of 1558 were in the Canterbury diocese. He wrote to the Pope himself, "God saved me to save others from heresy and cut off those who will not desist." And in the stipulations of the Bishop's Synod that he called once he was in England, there is a lot about heresy and what will happen to them. He was not, I think, in anybody's estimation, a hard, cruel man. John Fox, the martyrologist, is actually quite kind to him compared to Bishop Bonner, or Butcher Bonner, or Bloody Bonner, however you want to call them. I mean, Reginald wasn't locking heretics in his coal house and whipping them. He was trying to get them over to God's side. But if they wouldn't give up their mistaken, inverted commas, beliefs, then they had to burn.
And with that point you mentioned there about repenting, the most famous of the people to suffer is Thomas Cranmer, who does repent but is still burned, which is quite a controversial thing. What do we know of Reginald's involvement in that? Based on, you've just said that he was keen on people repenting, but this is an example where someone repents and then Mary still sees it through. Was this Mary putting her foot down, or was Reginald also involved there? Okay,
this was Mary putting her foot down. Okay. Reginald had no time for Cranmer. The second letter to him is pretty horrendous, but he did send theologians to try to get him to repent. He does repent, I think 6 or 7 times, and under church law he should not have been burnt, but this was Mary. After what he'd done to her mother.
It was personal.
It really did get personal. The irony being as well that Cranmer, who everybody thinks of as holier than holy, himself burnt 2 people and had some very interesting plans for heretics, and that would have been Catholics, if Edward VI had lived longer.
What do we know of Reginald and Mary's relationship? I think this is such a fascinating one. Is there truth in the suggestion that their mothers at one stage were looking to get them married? What do we know of their actual relationship?
They will have known each other, there's no doubt about that. Both were extremely pious. Beyond that, I really can't say that it would have been a suitable marriage. Yes, I would totally agree with that. I have a feeling that Reginald simply wasn't interested in that side of life at all, in any shape or form. So what would have come from it, I don't know. But he did, of course, agree to remain as a cardinal deacon, because he could then be absolved of his church orders and could then marry Mary if that was what they wanted. But I think the question here is what they wanted. What Reginald wanted is a different kettle of fish.
As far as his impact on her reign, though, they are close across her 5-year reign.
He was her right-hand man. I think it was the Venetian ambassador who said nothing can be done in England without Pole. He really was her right-hand man.
And touchingly, they actually died on the very same day. Just 8 hours, I think, divides their deaths. So what do we know of how Reginald died?
It was either double quartan fever, which essentially we would now call influenza. There was an epidemic and he'd been ill for months and he couldn't shake off the paroxysms, and he knew he was ill. In September, he wrote to Philip that he was mortally ill. So he knew there was something very wrong. And they do think that Mary died of the same thing. Now, whether this is influenza or something else, I'm not a medical historian, I really can't say. But there was certainly an epidemic, and they both went down with it. He died a good, holy death, pledged his loyalty to the church, which horrified some people back in Italy, had received extreme unction a couple of days before and passed very quietly away, surrounded by his servants who were completely devoted to him.
And would you say that Reginald was perhaps the only man in Mary's life who never let her down?
Interesting question, Adam. Yes and no. It's not that I like sitting on fences, but sometimes I have to. I also think Eustache Chapuis never let her down.
That's a good, yes, true.
He was
Yeah.
devoted to her and very loyal indeed. And yeah, so the two of them really.
My final question for you, and you touched on this briefly earlier, but towards the end of your book, you do talk about Reginald's artistic patronage. So I just wondered if you could discuss that in a bit more detail, because he met some extremely significant 16th century artists. I mean, did he meet Michelangelo?
Oh God, yes.
Yeah.
Michelangelo's biographer Condivi says that Michelangelo, and he didn't esteem many people, he was a grumpy old man, really did esteem Pole and considered him to be a friend. He will have known Michelangelo probably through his friendship with Vittoria Colonna and, of course, via the Pope. Michelangelo joined Pole at Viterbo in the 1540s when Pole had this little, I wouldn't call it a renegade group, little group of religious reformers. And Michelangelo rocks up there, and he's referred to as our Michelangelo, and referred to in letters as literally one of the group. But of course, he wasn't a theologian. He was just an artist who wanted to reform the church, wanted everybody to lead a nice life, a good life, sorry. So again, religion was the main thing that united them. Sebastiano del Piombo, oh, sorry, Michelangelo. Yes. Pole, in fact, owned a small Pietà. It's only about this big by Michelangelo. Didn't commission it himself, so his patronage doesn't extend to artists like Michelangelo. Painted for Vittoria Colonna, with whom Michelangelo had a very, very close relationship. And she gifted it to Pole so that he could take it to Trent, presumably to look at during difficult questions like justification by faith, which was, we won't go into that, we'll be here all night, a very thorny issue in the period, and one, again, and hopefully that would offer Reginald some comfort. Sebastiano del Piombo is one of my all-time favourite painters. I love his work. In my opinion, did paint the Hermitage portrait of Pole, which is on the cover of my book, which is, if you've not seen it, that one.
Yep.
Isn't it gorge? It's lovely. It is beautiful. Love it to bits.
Beautiful.
But this wasn't, people did have portraits painted of themselves, and people wanted portraits of Pole because he was known as this good, holy man. They wanted a good cardinal hung up in their house. Sebastiano had been in Viterbo before Pole, and Viterbo was a very reform-orientated place. And certainly by the end of his life, Sebastiano was still practicing the ideals of reform. There was to be no ostentatious funeral. All the money was to go to the poor. The other person is Lambert Lombard. You've got to love that name. You can really get your tongue around it. Lambert Lombard, who was a chance encounter.
It is good.
When Pole was sheltering in Liège, Lombard was the court painter of Cardinal Erard de la Marck. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And de la Marck wanted him to be educated in Renaissance art. So he says to Pole, any chance you'll be taking Lambert with you when you go back to Italy? So Pole does. And of course, Lambert gets to see all of Italy, long way round, etc., meet lots of important artists. But in return, Pole did, in fact, commission something. And that was a grisaille, a grey and white painting of, and again, religion comes into this, what was basically the path of the soul. And there is a wonderful drawing by Lombard, which you suspect may have been a parting gift because it didn't last long, because de la Marck died, of a crucified Christ based on a Michelangelo drawing. Was Pole a patron of artists? By chance. He didn't set out like most cardinals do to decorate his palace and have miniatures of himself that he could give people or whatever. I have a question, if I may. What's your opinion of Pole?
Reginald, very similar to yours, incredibly naive, I think. But I suppose, as I sort of indicated earlier, I think it's driven by his life experience. Had he been raised in the bosom of his family, I think he would have grown to be quite a different man. Certainly, had he not entered the church, I think we can certainly say that he'd have grown to be a very different man. But he was a product of his time. And I think that we must always, when we're talking about people who lived in the 16th century, we always should think of them in the context of the times in which they grew up. And I think that this was an age when religious belief was so fervent that it often outstripped familial loyalty. And I think Reginald was probably doing what he thought. I genuinely believe he thought he was doing what was best. I certainly believe that. But had he understood the gravity of the situation, probably would have been a bit different. But then he wouldn't have been Reginald Pole. He would have been a different man. So
would you have liked him?
Probably not.
Okay. I agree with your assessment of him. I think I would have liked him, but as I said to my husband, I can't see him doubled up with laughter.
Yeah, I say,
and a sense of humour is really important.
Yeah, I'll take it back. I don't necessarily think I would dislike him, but I don't think he was much. I think he was probably a bit of a fun sponge. And sort of sometimes,
well, I like that word,
sucked a bit of the air out of the room. Maybe he comes across as someone maybe a bit like some interpretations of Margaret Beaufort as being quite excessively grave and a bit always sort of intoning these. I can picture him being the sort of person who would quip Bible verse at you, left, right, and centre. So, as I say, something of a fun sponge. He's the antithesis of Edward IV, I suppose, is where I'm going. But that's not a bad. Doesn't make him a bad man. Just maybe a touch dull, maybe.
I think he was much loved by his servants and by his friends, but he was extremely conscientious, devoted to God, devoted to the church, tried to do the right thing.
Yeah.
He did his best, essentially.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. This has been really interesting.
No, thank you for having me.
About this man. So the book is now out. You can get it in all bookshops, on Amazon and so on.
Yeah. So if you want to contact Amberley direct, I think you even get it at a discount.
Well, thank you very much again for coming on the podcast, and we'll maybe speak at some point in the future. That brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chest podcast. My thanks to Helen for coming onto the podcast, and my thanks to you, the listener, for tuning in. Next week, I am pleased to be welcoming back Heather Darcy onto the podcast, this time for a discussion about her upcoming book, If Any Person Will Meddle of My Cause, The Judicial Murder of Anne Boleyn. In this fascinating book, Heather explores the political missteps and the implications of Anne Boleyn's queenship, delving into the threat that she posed to Henry, and why legal changes made during the early years of the English Reformation ultimately allowed him to judicially murder his inconvenient second wife. As such, we will cover a lot of ground of Anne's story that has never been examined in a true legal sense, which is something that Heather is extremely knowledgeable about. That will drop next Thursday. If you've got any suggestions for future podcast episodes or podcast guests, please do drop me a message on Instagram, or if you're a follower on Patreon, you can drop me a message there. Thank you very much for listening to the Tudor Chess podcast, and chat to you next week.